Let me welcome everybody. Let me welcome you to the Future Trends Forum. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm your host, cat herder, and MC for the next hour. And I'm delighted to see you all here. I'm looking forward very much to today's conversation. But before we can begin the conversation, let me give you some background about where the forum comes from, how it works, and what it is. So let's start with a couple of quick slides. The forum is a spin-off from the Future Trends in Technology and Education report. If you haven't seen that, FTTE is a monthly trends analysis. It takes a look at about 86 trends mapped across technology, education, and the fusion of education and technology. We've been tracking these for years, so we now have a pretty good map of where certain trends are really strong, where some are weak. It gives us a sense of where we could be headed in education and technology. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it yet, go to ftte.us and you can find out more. That's a report. What we do here in the forum is discuss. So this is all about conversation. We're only going to present for just another minute. So over to the next slide, please, Chris. Now, this is also part of an overall project called the Future of Education Observatory. Now, this is a participatory, open, multimedia strategy of trying to better understand where education technology can go. That includes this forum, that includes the FTT report, it includes a regular blog, it includes a book club you'll hear about at the end of the hour, it includes a bookstore, which you'll also hear about. So this is a fascinating project. If you're new to it, please go to futureofeducation.us and you can learn more about it. Now, I want to also emphasize that although I'm speaking to you from the United States, indeed today I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., the capital, this is a transnational, international forum. We believe passionately in discussion that crosses national boundaries because education and technology cross those boundaries. And we learn about this all the time. So if you look at this map, you'll see that we've had sign-ins and participation from all over the world. And we're really glad to see that. So as we proceed, keep in mind the way that education technology can change and morph beyond your own nation, region, or continent. Now, we can only do this work thanks to generous support, and I want to thank our sponsors and supporters before we go further. To begin with, I'm grateful to NYSERNet in New York State. This is a nonprofit that works to connect that state's colleges, universities, libraries, and museums with broadband connectivity. They've been very great, very generous to us, and we're grateful to them for all their help. We're also grateful to Shindig. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it, Shindig provides this technology we're using now. So let me just quickly walk you through the key features that make it work for today. So where I am, and where this slide is just for a minute, is called the stage. Everyone can see and hear what we do and say up here. And you can join us, and I'll show you how in just a second. Now below us, if you take a look around, you'll see the audience or the participant group. And you can see a whole bunch of different icons and logins. You can see, say, Liz Evans, who's now looking at us. You can see the silhouette of Carlos Guevara. You can see all kinds of people. So if you'd like to talk to them, there are a few ways. One is you can click on them, and if they want to talk to you and your camera and mic are working, your two icons will click together like Lego bricks. You'll have your own private audiovisual bubble, which is pretty neat. Now, if you want to find more and more people, there are a couple of ways to do that. On the bottom right edge of the screen, you should see a chevron with the word more. You can click that way, scroll through people, or you can go to the bottom of the screen. There's that white strip running along it. On the leftmost edge, you'll see what looks like a bunch of heads and a dialog box and a number. If you click that, up will scroll a kind of film strip of all the people who are in on this conversation right now, which looks like about 35 people and more coming in. So you can just scroll through there to get a little bit more information about all of them. So if you're interested in who Kimberly Scott is, you can see she's an educator, or so is Carol. And you can just get more information there as you move around. Now, when you pop that up comes one of the first interaction tools. On the right side, you should see a text box. It has a chat box where people can say anything. And we often will share comments, questions, observations about what we're talking about. So please use that. We can have that kind of conversation running the entire time. We've done some changes behind the scenes. So if you're a forum veteran, take a look and see what you think of the changes. So that's a spot to have conversations and to ask questions. Now, back to that white strip. There are two more options you should know about. There's a little question mark with a circle around it. If you click that, up will pop a dialog box and you can type in a question or a comment you'd like to ask. And when the time is right, we'll flash it on the screen and I'll read it out loud. And that's really useful if you've got something that you want to share. And if your microphone doesn't work or your camera doesn't work or you're not in a good space to be able to speak. Now, if your camera does work and your microphone does work and you're in a space where you can talk out loud, fantastic. Click the raised hand button. This is the best part because then we can throw you up on stage. And right now, up on the stage, there can be 4 of us at the same time. So that can be you, Professor Grawe, this week's guest, and 2 of us just up here talking back and forth. If you haven't seen it, it's easy as can be. We do this all the time. So my point is, what I'm doing right now of telling you things is what we're not going to be doing the rest of the hour. The rest of the hour is all conversation. Click that raised hand, use that question mark, click the chat box, show us your questions, thoughts, pushback, celebrations, and examples. That's what this hour is about. And we're very, very grateful to Shindig for making this technology available. We're also grateful to the dozens of people on Patreon who have been supporting us for years now. If you haven't seen it, Patreon is a crowdfunding site where people can support creative people making stuff. In this case, it's making stuff about the future of education. So if you go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander, you can see all these different people who've signed up to different levels of support. Each level gives you certain different bonuses that we can share. You can contribute as little as $1 a month. We're grateful to all those people for making us able to do all this work. So we're thankful to them. Please join them if you can. Now, on to this week's guest. I'm very, very grateful to be able to introduce Professor Nathan Grawe. He is a professor of economics at Carleton College, so he is definitely someone who knows about winter. And today, we're going to be talking about demographics, their impact on the future of education, based in part and largely on his new book, which is really extraordinary. I strongly recommend, called Demographics and the Demand for Higher Education. Professor Grawe, can you hear and see us?
I can. Thanks for
Excellent.
having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. I'm really grateful for you to be able to come. That's a great bookshelf you've got.
Thank you. I made it all clean for today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm a book person, so I'm very envious. So the first question I'd like to begin with, and friends, remember, I have a ton of questions, but it's your questions that really drive this. So please, as we go, you'll have questions and comments to go. My first is, what are you researching and teaching this year? What is your main focus in the classroom and in the research world?
At Carleton, we have a small department, so we end up teaching whatever is needed. So this year I'm teaching healthcare economics and industrial organization. My research right now has got a couple things going. One is looking at how financial aid formulas may influence labor market decisions, especially of second wage earners. So it's a tax of a sort. If I earn more, I don't get to keep it because my kid's in college, and so the colleges are going to take some. And then I'm also looking to follow up on the book that we're talking about today, doing some interviews with higher ed leaders to talk about how they are responding. Already I've heard from a number of institutions that are proactively looking forward, seeing demographic change and taking actions, whether it's in recruitment or in pedagogy or a whole host of other strategies.
Oh, I'd like to hear about those in a little while. That would be really, really useful to hear. Your second income book, didn't Elizabeth Warren co-write a book on the 2-income trap some years ago?
Yeah, so that's not going to be a book, but rather a journal level, an article length piece. There's been some work on tax effects in general, but what hasn't been done is to look at how the financial aid formulas play out in particular.
Okay. Well, I'm really looking forward to that. That sounds like very, very important stuff for us to have. Thank you. Let's dive into your big work on demographics in higher education. I tried to brutally summarize your book as best I could, especially as a humanist. So I'm automatically off kilter in trying to do this. But my understanding, based on your research, is that you see the traditional age undergraduate population in the United States at a plateau level, so not growing but plateauing for now. And then in about a decade, it's going to collapse. It's really going to plummet.
Yeah, that's more or less right.
Okay.
Yeah, the plummeting comes from fertility changes that happened around the time of the Great Recession. It's not uncommon during recessions for people to delay births. So when the 2008 financial crisis hit, we weren't surprised to see fertility drop. Of course, that was a really deep recession, and the decrease in fertility was pretty large, about 13%. And as of today, it hasn't rebounded. So we have very low fertility. And that, you play out 18 years later, and that turns into less demand for traditionally aged college students.
So we're talking about, say, 2021, 2023.
A little bit further on. So if 2008, looking more like 2026.
Okay. So this is, people who have been following my work know that I obsess over demographics because they're very slow moving, much more predictable than many other forces, and they really have the power to reshape so much. Let me just ask, and we already have a question, so let me just get my question in quickly. Why hasn't fertility rebounded? By some metrics, the economy has rebounded. That is, the major measure of unemployment is very, very low. Incomes have started to trickle back a little bit. That sounds good. Why haven't we been spawning more babies?
Yeah, I don't know that we know the answer to that. I think it's an important question. We can imagine trends. For instance, millennials have changed attitudes about material things in general. They're less likely to own homes, more likely to rent. They think MP3 files are a fine form of music acquisition, where my collection was CDs and maybe before that LPs. I think they find that sort of physical collecting or things more suspect. It's true that the economy has rebounded by some measures. By labor force participation, though, it hasn't rebounded nearly as much. And where we saw a real drop in fertility was in the Hispanic population in particular. So I wouldn't be surprised if the lagging parts of the economy may be concentrated in the subpopulation where we saw that change. So it's not. I don't think we know the answer, but we can think of some possible answers.
Okay. No, that's fascinating. That's really, really fascinating. And this has obviously huge impact on most of colleges and universities, which rely heavily on the traditional age 18 to 22-year-old population. Let me ask if you could really, really quickly, you created a huge model called HEDI, which is a great acronym for Higher Education Demand Index. And it leads to all kinds of easy visualizations and graphics and puns. The official beer for HEDI must be HEDI Topper, I imagine, that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
And I just want to, as a supporter of open content, I just want to give you a shout out for putting this on the web, where it's easily available.
Yeah, so the idea of HEDI was, as you noted, demographic forces can be very strong. And I saw a presentation at Carleton looking at the change in fertility and what that would mean for the number of 18-year-olds. My first thought was, boy, this looks very frightening because the numbers overall are falling. They're falling in particular in the Northeast, where we draw a lot of students. Did this mean the end of my kind of education? And one possible answer is no, because this is looking at the total number of students, but Carleton, and for that matter, every institution, two-year colleges to elites, don't draw from the average population. They draw from a subset. So then I started wondering, well, what would it look like if we looked at the market for a particular institution type? Is there any way to adjust? So what the HEDI does is to use U.S. Department of Education data, a longitudinal study, to predict the probability of college going based on basic demographic statistics, and then to adjust the demographic headcounts for those probabilities. So for instance, if you are an Asian woman with both parents at home making $140,000 a year living in Boston, and your parents have more than a college education, the probability of going to college is astronomical. It's over 90%. An elite college is over 70%. But if you're a young Hispanic male living with mom alone, income of $40,000, she's a high school dropout, well, then you're looking at a probability of an elite college attendance of only something like 2%, and college attendance at all something like 10%. Clearly, treating these two individuals as the same in our demographic counts for future demand for education just misses the mark. So the purpose of the HEDI was to see whether or not that changed anything, and it does. The elites look like they're going to do pretty well, driven by rising parental education and rising numbers of Asian Americans. The demographic forces, though, are really strong. And so for higher education as a whole, the model still predicts pretty dramatic cuts for most of the country, especially in the Northeast. And in all of the Northeast states and cities, we're looking at drops of 15 or 20% or more in the number of students who are likely to attend a regional four-year institution, and similar numbers for two-year colleges. So that the drop in birth rates, and it's been concentrated in the Northeast, just it can't be avoided even by making these probability adjustments and saying, well, maybe it's different kids who aren't being born. Maybe our market is okay. When you're losing that many births, it's pretty tough for the industry as a whole.
It really, really is tough. I have to ask about the different ethnicities in the U.S. I mean, it's kind of a truism on the one hand that the student population is going to increasingly become non-white, and in particular is really going to be driven by the major non-white population, which is Hispanic. But in your book, you argue that growth is actually going to be relatively slow, depending on regional variations, in part because the population tends to not be wealthy and also to have parents who are not college educated as well. So that's really going to slow down the Hispanic growth as well. Am I right in that? Or?
Yes. So you've got a large number and a growing number of such students, but if they're not well attached to higher education, then it may not be pushing higher education as much as it's pushing the population. The other thing that we see when we look at those probabilities of attendance, Hispanic students, insofar as they are going to college, are more likely to attend a two-year college or a regional four-year college, less likely to go to elite institutions. So where you will see the Hispanic growth be what increasing diversity looks like, that's likely to be two-year colleges and regional 4 years. At national colleges, colleges and universities that are drawing from across the country, their growth and diversity is more likely to be Asian Americans. In all cases, we're likely to see less diversity in the form of African Americans. So, the other thing you can do with the Hetty is you can look at those kinds of predictions and say, well, that's maybe not what we want to see. And then you can ask, what if we alter the probabilities to make it more likely that students of a particular type attend college, and will that change the predictions?
And I think you ended up your discussion of that by saying that again, please forgive me if I misread this, that the strongest policy intervention we can do is to try to encourage attendance by poorer people. Like I think it was the lowest 20 or 40% of the population. That would be stronger than targeting a subset.
Well, it looked like if you were to choose between having the gaps due to income or having the gaps due to race, yes, the income, focusing on income would both policies would would increase attendance overall. But when you focus on income, you end up also addressing some of the racial gaps, whereas focusing on race, you don't, it turns out, address the income gaps quite as well. But the other thing that came out of that, which was unfortunate, is, one of the questions might be, well, if we see this demographic change coming due to fertility, what if we just, go to the recruiting department, go to admissions and say, hey, you just got to market better. If we get higher college attendance rates, then we can get through this demographic crisis. The answer is no for two reasons. One is because even a really aggressive change in recruiting isn't going to overcome the size of the demographic change that's coming. And second, that strategy doesn't necessarily work the same for two-year colleges as, say, for elite four-year colleges. Two-year colleges, for instance, would be disadvantaged if public policy were to make the income disparities less, because lower income people are more likely to go to two-year colleges. If they start behaving more like high-income families because of public policy intervention, that might be a good thing for society. We could talk about the pros and cons, but for a two-year college administrator, that might be downright frightening, because it means a lot of their demand base just went down the street to the four-year institutions.
So maybe we may be looking down the road at an interesting intersectoral competition for population.
Exactly. Yep.
Oh, that could be very dark.
Yeah, and I think there are some parts of this problem that we can work at collectively, where we have common interests in mind. And then other parts of this problem where realistically we are going to be more competitors. And while maybe from society's point of view, it would be better if institutions collaborated, the reality is there are going to be a lot of pressures. For instance, publics versus privates. There's been a long-standing debate about whether public funds, grant funds, should follow students to private institutions. It's nice for us to think that, well, publics and privates are kind of in this demographic crisis together. But when the rubber hits the road, I bet that debate will get more intense, and it's going to drive a bit of a wedge, with public saying we're starved for money, and some of this money is going to well-endowed privates. Is that really sustainable? So I think some of those issues are going to be difficult for us to navigate.
We're always seeing that in New York State, when the state has just announced the Excelsior tuition grant, which is aimed at public institutions. And already I'm hearing from different colleges and universities that 2-year colleges and some private colleges are seeing attendance drop. So that private-public competition is warming up. I have more questions, but I've been outflanked by the wonderful forum population who has a few. So if we could begin with, from Ray Garcelon, he had a question about demographic changes, how they impact university continuing education divisions.
Yeah, that's a great question. The data that I have to estimate the probabilities is coming from longitudinal studies that look at high school students and then track them into college. And that's how I'm estimating these probabilities. One thing that's really unfortunate is we don't have nearly the same kind of longitudinal information on college attendance patterns of older generation students. It's certainly true that it's expensive to continue following up with people, but then it means that we end up with a blind spot. And so I would say we really don't have a great view on what's going on with demographics and how that'll play out for, say, age 30 to 40 year old students. One thing I can say is that I'm guessing that as the number of traditionally aged students decreases, college administrators are going to be pressed toward looking for alternative student pools, and they might well look at the non-traditionally aged. That's exactly what happened in the 70s and 80s, and today about 1/4 of enrollments are non-traditional students. One question I have for people who are looking at that as a solution to the demographic problem is just how far can you go with this? We already pulled that lever once, or at least we partially pulled it. Can you go to that well again? Or will you just be trying to recruit students who are already recruited in essence and end up with nothing more? I don't think we know the answer to that, though.
That well could be tapped out. Ray, that's a fantastic question. And I suspect, I've been saying this for several years, that we'll be seeing more and more emphasis paid on adult education in different forms. We have a question from Tom Hames, which is, are you seeing increased efforts from Northeast and Midwest colleges to recruit from the South and the West where there is still growth? Also, what about cutting out-of-state tuition to compete cost-wise?
Yeah, so I know the Midwest college is a little better than the Northeast, and I know for sure that the answer there is yes. Texas is a place that people are trying to figure out. Florida is a place people are trying to figure out. It's challenging, as people are noting the weather in their hellos. Northfield today is a beautiful high of 40 degrees, but we also had a series of days where the high was below zero. And going down to Texas and Florida and saying, how would you like to move up to Minnesota, where we have a slightly different weather and, to be blunt, maybe more importantly, we have a very different culture and it might not look anything like home. That's a hard sell. And so colleges are definitely looking into this, but their ability to crack those markets is limited. I think we're trying to figure out how we can build on successful toeholds that have been created by our institutions already. Where do we have a pipeline begun, and rather than taking a diffuse approach? On the question of out of state, I know I saw that the Chronicle had an article on Maine and the challenges that Maine is facing. The Northeast there are long-term trends on fertility in the Northeast that are driving population down even now. So they're sort of drifting downward, and then they go off this dearth birth cliff. Maine has been operating with the same kind of strategies that were just suggested about out-of-state tuition for out-of-state students getting in-state tuition. That just means we're increasing the discount rate. You don't have to call it the discount rate. You can change the sticker price, but it's the same principle. And we've obviously seen a lot of discounting going on with financial difficulty. When supply and demand doesn't favor the institutions, discount rates go up. So yes, we're seeing it already. I suspect we're going to see more pressure that way. I think there are going to be more conversations by boards of trustees about how long you can continue to increase the discount rate before the whole financial model breaks down.
Just to
I suspect people will try it.
Just to make sure everyone's on the same page, the discount rate is the amount below the sticker price of tuition that the typical student actually pays. So if the college costs $100,000 and the discount rate is 30%, it means that most students usually pay the average student pays $70,000. Right now, the discount rates have been rising and rising and rising, and Nukugo studies had the discount rate at first-year institutions as being between 40 and 50%. So when we hear the sticker price of a college or university, that's only paid by a small proportion of the population.
And ironically, with the suggestion here about offering in-state tuition to out-of-state students, that's going to lower the sticker price. So it's going to make the official discount rate go down, because instead of asking 100,000, you say, well, what if we charge you only 80,000 and you're paying 70,000 or something like that? So but in the end of the day, the institution's collecting less revenue one way or another, and it does end up bringing in students, but it brings in students at the cost of lost revenue.
I just have to say, friends, one of the overall takeaways from your book is that this is pretty frightening stuff, that we are seeing a huge, huge challenge hitting now, and it's going to get worse in the decade. I just want to share a comment from the chat box, and this is from Teresa Gilliard-Cook, who says, adult learners, the demographic that my team and I look at since we work with faculty to develop online courses. However, if public and private institutions fail to remove barriers for adult learnings, it'll still be problematic. Teresa, if you want to join us on stage, just please click the hand. I'd love to hear more about this. Or if you have to say it in the chat, that'd be great too. We have a video question coming in. I think this is from Stephen Crawford. Let's bring him up on stage, if we can. I need a sound effect. I really do. Maybe the Star Trek transporter or so, or a drum roll or a rising tone. Maybe Ride of the Valkyries. So let's see if we can get from.
Well, the best tone I can give you is from Wayne's World.
Oh yes! Oh yes! Greetings, Steve. Greetings, Ian.
So one of the questions that I was wondering about is, we were talking, we've seen campuses increase amenities on campus to attract students, and obviously that caters to the elite. But we've also seen the rise of online education, where they're trying to reach students that are place-bound. And a lot of schools, mine included, have reached beyond their traditional regional reach to go nationwide and beyond. So how do you see the role of online education impacting these trends?
That's a great question. I think a lot is yet to be seen, because it's a new technology and people are coming up with new ways to use it. Early on, the focus on MOOCs seemed to take a very narrow view of what this technology could do. I've seen some really great examples at two-year colleges where they still have a traditional class concept. They meet, however, only once a week in person, and then they have an asynchronous forum discussion time using online technology to break down those problems of synchronicity, so the student with a young child or who has a job can still go to college with only minimal disruption to their schedule. So I think those are some great examples of how colleges are using the tools to try to tap into new markets. And I think there will be real motivation to try new experiments. You also commented that technology not only can solve synchronicity issues, but it can potentially reach out across geographic barriers. Most colleges draw from a very, very local market. The average distance, the median distance for between a student at a two-year college's high school and the two-year college they attended was something like 15 miles. It's very, very, very local. If you're in a market that's going downward demographically, rather than just taking your lumps, I can imagine some schools saying, we are going to have to be a leader in online education in order to try to reach into new markets. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's dangerous to look at the heady predictions and to look in your own market and say, oh, well, it looks pretty good for me, so I can ignore all this stuff. Because I think that presumes that everyone else is just going to take what's coming to them and like it. And I don't think they will. I think there are going to be some very interesting and disruptive technological innovations and other innovations trying to break through. Now, will these work? That remains to be seen. But I think there are a lot of people who've been thinking carefully about, moving beyond, like I said, the MOOC model, moving beyond just that first, well, what if we throw some video lectures online? We can do a lot more sophisticated things, as we're seeing here this afternoon.
Well, I mean, you look at what's happened over the last 15, 20 years in online education. I've spent most of my career in that area, and my previous institution relied on the satellite locate campuses. And you're right. The idea was that within our state, you'd be no further than 50 miles from a campus. And we saw where that was very successful, but it was also synchronous satellite-based television courses where you had interactivity. My current institution, 10 years ago, we had a couple hundred students online. Now we're well over 20,000. and 60 plus degree programs at varying levels. So, and we've seen a number of online programs succeed, mine being one of them. And we've seen Inside Higher Ed talk about Florida a number of times where they didn't quite hit those numbers. So it seems to be a very interesting period to try to get into that game now, because I think what you said, those regional factors are much more in place now than I think, whereas 10 years ago, it was a little bit more open.
Right. Another thing that's different is that the students are different. If we think about traditional age students, but they'll eventually be non-traditional age. I graduated from college in 1996. When I got to my college campus, I took 2 months to pick up my email address. It was my first email address ever. Wasn't quite sure what I would want with an email address. 2 months later, I figured out some modest use. Well, my daughter today is 16. Her entire known life is in the context of smart devices and smartphones. So when we rolled out the initial online education options, it was rolled out to an audience that frankly looked at it as an oddity. But as we go forward, you're going to be rolling out these technologies in more sophisticated fashions like this one to a population that's very, very comfortable with communicating online and having group text chats and group video chats. I think we should reserve judgment on what the initial outcomes have been when we've seen some flash in the pans that didn't bear fruit. I think it's unwise to think, well, then it could never bear fruit. With a different audience, maybe it works much better. So I think there's going to be a lot of exciting innovation in this area.
Well, one thing I'd point out is I would consider MOOCs the state of the art of online education from the 90s.
Right.
We've been doing stuff like this for 10 years easily, and I think also when you look at the demographics, traditionally it had been 10 to 15 years above the traditional students, and we're beginning to see that number lower as more and more traditional age students are taking online programs.
The other force that will go this way is thinking about just overhead. So as Brian described, the demographics suggest a plateau and then hitting a cliff. Making investments in bricks and mortar right now then becomes really dicey, because in about a decade, you're going to be facing the need to downsize potentially. In that context, investing in a much lighter footprint that's online allows you to teach students today in large numbers and then relatively cheaply downsize to a smaller number of students if necessary. So I think they're both going to be demand side factors, like you were discussing, and also some supply side factors that will drive institutions to think about how can we use this technology to accomplish what we need to accomplish in education very, very effectively, but in a very different way.
Well said. That's a great question, Stephen. Thank you very much. And that's an awesome beard, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm feeling a little naked.
I know. Sorry, it's just the way things. I could loan you some if you want.
You could.
Friends, just to let you know, beaming up Steve, it was that easy, and to join us on stage for video. And if you have more questions and comments, you can see this is a rich, powerful subject with incredible implications. This is, I think, one of the strongest themes we've ever had on the forum. So please come on video or send us the text chat or ask us the question with the question mark button. We had a couple of observations from the chat box and from Twitter I wanted to share. Gerald Petrozella mentions the, let's see, he works at a small liberal arts college, and faculty struggle to imagine a robust online environment. And they imagine things that are actually pretty awful. So that's, room to move. Tom Hames mentions that a school that emphasizes a personal touch, like many small liberal arts colleges, will find it difficult to do online. So I think this is a case for experimentation and development.
Yeah, and I would just point out, as I talk about all of these things, I think in the end, institutions are going to find that they need to develop their own path. What's going to work for a Carleton is not going to work for University of Minnesota or a community college. So it's probably not going to be the case that my institution, Carleton, which has sold this high personalized touch model, is going to shift to online. But at the same time, our trustees and faculty are pushing for experimentation to find new ways to use the technology to do better what we do. I think it is critical that we maintain real focus as we go through this kind of demographic transition on what is it we're selling and make sure that we make good on that. And that obviously is different for each institution. So Carleton, it wouldn't be appropriate to move all of our course offerings online, but I have colleagues who use software like this to do office hours at 11 o'clock at night when it's more convenient for them for whatever reason, and our students are working at that hour. There are all sorts of synchronicities that we struggle with as well. And so while what the community college was wrestling with isn't the same as what we're wrestling with, the same technology may in different uses be a useful response.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, I think you've had this conversation before. Friend, let's point a little further ahead. Let's think about what can be done in terms of actions, and also let's think about how this might play out over the next decade. We have two comments that I wanted to share along those lines. One from Fritz Vandover, who asks this good dark question: assuming college-going rates among demographic groups stay the same, do these demographic changes forecast more and more closures among smaller institutions and those with harder financial profiles?
Yeah, probably. We've already seen an uptick in the number of closures and mergers. Now, in the current tense, I think we're seeing a lot of closures of for-profits, and that might just be sort of burning off some foam in a frothy market where it was kind of the hot thing to be entering, and people were entering that market without a lot of thought. But even when you take out the for-profits, we've seen an increase, about a doubling in the number of closures over the last couple of years. And that's just in the context of sort of a drift in demand, nothing like what we're likely to see as the birth dearth hits. So I suspect we're going to see some institutions finding closures and mergers being a solution. One question that I have about that consolidation choice is, how exactly do you intend to save money? You got two campuses, they're close to each other, so now we'll call them one institution. That's great, but you've got to eliminate costs if this is going to help. And getting rid of, say, the top level of administration, while one step toward reducing costs, isn't going to be near enough to turn it around for most institutions. When we see other private sector firms go through a merger, usually the week after that, we hear the announcement of which divisions are getting laid off. So if we have consolidations, that's not an easier path than closures, I don't think. I think it raises, in fact, some more challenging questions of how in the world do you still make this work?
Terrific question, Fritz, and that's a really deep answer. We may return to that before the hour is out. We had another question, which is also dark from another angle, from Ray Garslam, who says, Nathan's earlier details about demographic changes and probability of attending a private school made me think of a lawsuit that's been in the news. He cites a title: Justice Department is threatening to sue Harvard for Asian American discrimination. If the Asian American population is continuing to grow, both numerically and in terms of college attendance, do you think we're going to see tension like that? Charges of quotas or discrimination?
Well, a couple things happen as demand falls off. Things should turn toward being more student-centric in the market. If you're a student, you should be on the better end of the market. And so I would expect then that institutions as a whole, might not be able to discriminate against one group or another group as much as they might currently do, because they can't, beggars can't be choosers. If they need students, they're going to take students. I do wonder, though, the predictions show growth for elite institutions, and a lot of that growth is driven by Asian American students. In recent past, admissions departments have chosen to value a more representative student body, arguably at the expense of Asian Americans. Will they continue to do that? If they have more students, they'll actually have the capacity to do even more of that. If you're a second-tier school, you might do very well by saying, well, we'll take these very smart, very talented kids who are going to do great things that for whatever reason you've just decided you don't want. And I could imagine some second-tier schools getting very savvy at building their reputation of selectivity by taking advantage of discrimination by other market players.
Whoa! Oh, that's sneaky. Oh, wow.
We saw something similar with Jewish discrimination in the early 20th century, where some institutions had quotas, we just won't take Jews. Well, other institutions said, we're not going to discriminate. If you don't discriminate, then you can take advantage.
Right. Oh, that's good. Ray followed up in chat by saying that this lawsuit's only against Harvard, which fulfills what you're talking about. The very top tier having the possibility of this. We have more questions just coming in now. One from Paul Baldridge, who asks, so what are your thoughts on how the change in demographics could impact federal student financial aid and private student loans? Great question for an economist.
With fewer students, those programs should be a little bit less expensive to administer. Then you have to ask, what's the government going to do if there's some relief there? Unfortunately, while there might be some small relief in terms of demands on educational expenses, we also know in the next several years we're expected to see Medicaid and Medicare expenses explode. I'm not sanguine for public funding of education. We've seen since the Great Recession a dramatic pullback by states in terms of how much they fund. It used to be the parents picked up a third of the tab, and in about a dozen years, they're now picking up about half of the tab, as especially the Medicaid portion, which is paid by states, increases. I think state budgets are going to see a lot of pressure, and when state legislators decide how they're going to fill in that budget hole caused by Medicaid expenditures, higher ed has another source of income, which is the family contribution. And so it's a little bit easier for a legislator to say, oh, we didn't cut that. We just shifted the cost to somebody else. And so I fear higher ed is going to have a hard time at the State House because of that. So I think there will be some relief in terms of student loan expenditures for the government, but that probably is going to be offset by other factors that are making those budgets tighter.
Okay. Well, that's a great political economy answer for a terrific question, Paul. We have more questions coming, so I'm not going to ask any. Everybody here has brilliant comments. What's the next one that we have? Let's see. This is from Lori Williams. What recommendations might you have, given the future demographic changes, for quality assurance and accreditation? I can't speak for Lori, but I imagine that one question would be, the classic problem of does an institution lower academic standards in order to get more people in?
Yeah, I think for some institutions, there's going to be a question about, are they, due to financial pressures, recruiting students who they more or less know aren't a good fit? And you'd see that in retention and persistence rates. And so if I'm an accreditor doing a site visit in 10 years, I might be more attuned to show me your retention statistics. Are you balancing your budget by simply letting students in who can't make it? But I would point out it could go the opposite way. If I'm an institution right now, for years we've tried to increase retention rates because it's the right thing to do. It fulfills our mission. And I think people really are honestly interested in those altruistic goals. But in 10 years, there's going to be a financial goal as well. If you want to stay solvent, you need to find students, and it might be really hard to recruit new students. If you have a student who's already on your campus, they've already said they would like to study there, but for whatever reason, the institution isn't meeting their needs, and so persistence and retention are an issue. That might be the easiest student to recruit. Figuring out how to make the institution work for your students so that they do retain may be the way that many institutions get through this crisis. And the Chronicle article I mentioned about Maine, that's exactly what University of Southern Maine has done. And by increasing their retention rates by 6 percentage points, they were actually able to see a budget increase despite demographics really going in the opposite direction. So, I am worried that institutions will lower standards in order to make their books balanced. But another thing they might do is double down on the quality of what they're providing. So it doesn't have to be a negative force. Sometimes competition like this can bring us to our better selves.
Near me, St. Michael's College in Vermont said that they were going to deliberately shrink their population. They're going to get ahead of the curve. And one of the ways they were going to do that was by increasing attention per student and the quality. Before I say anything more about that, though, hello, Teresa.
Hi, Brian. How are you? Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly. Where are you today?
Okay. I'm actually in Syracuse, New York, because SUNY Oswego has a branch campus there.
And I bet let me guess, it's probably snowing there.
No, it is actually beautifully sunny out.
What? That's illegal.
Yes.
In Syracuse. Oh my
Isn't
gosh.
it though? Isn't it though?
Well, welcome. And I really appreciate your comments before.
Okay. Well, as I said before, I mean, the one thing that we see is there are a lot of barriers to students in like online programs. And that has to do not so much with the financial aspects, but some other barriers as far as acceptance of credits, acceptance of other work, maybe doing things like different types of assessments, using portfolios, and those kinds of things. And those are the things we're seeing. Because, for example, I just had a conversation with my assistant dean this morning. We're trying to get one of our online students graduated. They're missing one course. And the program that this is going through, they have decided, no, that particular course that a student took at another institution doesn't meet the same criteria. But you can do a waiver. Why won't you do some kind of a waiver? So those are the other barriers that come into play here, particularly with non-traditional students. And having been a non-traditional student with my undergraduate degree, my graduate degree, these are the types of things that made me crazy when certain courses I took could still be used. It was just, yeah, okay, it didn't have this little component, but it had everything else. So those are some of the things we see within our area in extended learning at SUNY Oswego. So that, I think, goes into some of the monies too.
It does. I would say it reminds me, though, of a lot of the conversations we've had in recent years, but now not that recent, about two-year college coursework, whether or not those courses can transfer. And what happened there was a lot of state legislators said, okay, it is imperative for our constituents that we make college affordable. For many people, that means at least starting at a two-year college. And we're just going to mandate that you are going to have to make things uniform and understandable so that the credit work done at the two-year college easily transfers to the four-year. And I suspect the same thing's going to happen here. There's going to be a drive towards some sort of conformity and standards so that students can more easily navigate the online. Right now, you've got a student who's going through and a student has a problem. But when it becomes a large critical mass of people who are having the same problem, then all of a sudden action happens and people say, okay, come on, we got to figure this out. And technology is improving and how we can figure out. Early on, there were questions about, well, can you figure out who did the work and things like that? I think if we put our minds to it, we're going to find good, solid ways to solve that. I'm not a huge technology in the classroom person, but I understand that, I'm coming from Carleton College where we sell a very different vision. In other parts of the education sphere, I'm convinced we're going to see more and more use of the technology because it is powerful and because it does meet the needs of some students and some institutions.
We do that now with thinking about outside the box, thinking about how we do this. And this is just one specific example. It's looking too at yes, the community colleges and many of the SUNY four-year institutions and the community colleges have the 2+2 agreements where students do 2 years at the community college and then they transfer as long as they meet a certain GPA requirement to the four-year institution. But I want to go back to something Brian said too when he talked. I think it was you, Brian, who said something about the Excelsior Scholarship. And we're seeing some things with that too, some interesting things with that, because it's impacting not only community colleges, but the comprehensives in different ways, because now students are seeing with the Excelsior, they can go to the larger university centers in many cases, especially if they have the grades and whatnot. So we're seeing it, how it can impact us. Plus, nobody's seen any money yet, but that's neither here nor there.
I understand. Wow, that's a great story to bring up. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Professor Grawe, did you want to say more about that?
Yeah, it seems just like a classic example of policy playing out in both intended and unintended ways. And I think it's really easy on the front end of policy change to focus on the designed upsides of a policy. But then we always have to live out all of the effects. And, in this case, I'm not surprised that it has some negative effects for two-year institutions in particular. That, and I guess my question would ultimately be, well, one of the questions I'd ultimately have is, does this serve the students well? If the students do well at the four-year institution, terrific. But if what we end up doing is taking a student who maybe needed to go through the two-year college experience for one reason or another because it provided the support and the kind of instruction that they needed in order to ease into that four-year experience, that would be a shame. We'll have to see what happens as the students go through the Excelsior.
Right, exactly, because the jury's still out with that. I mean, we have
Right.
no real data pertaining, other than we know, for example, at our institution, how many students are using it and how many students could have some issues because they're not meeting certain criteria. But other than that, we don't have any data to say
Right.
just how well Excelsior is working.
Well, but we will at some point.
I hope so.
Well, stick around for a minute. We have Gerald Petrozella. Forgive me if I mangled your name.
Oh no, that sounds marvelous. Thanks.
Well, where are you today, and what's your question?
Well, I'm in North Adams, Massachusetts, in Western Mass, and I have a question, maybe for Teresa, but really for whoever might want to answer it. And I'm thinking about this broader conversation of online learning, but I'm wondering about what folks are seeing in terms of access to technology. Things like broadband not being available in rural areas. Populations for whom a mobile device is their primary device. These are the sorts of things that seem to me could I guess I should say should be worth thinking about and thinking carefully about as we consider online learning to be a good thing, capital G, capital T. And I was just throwing it out there to see what folks are seeing around those issues.
Great question.
Well, as an instructional designer, those are some of the things we do think about as far as particularly the mobile devices, because we're finding more and more of our students are trying to use them to take tests and their fully online courses and to hand in work and participate in discussion forums and whatever. I think some of the other concerns have to do with the access to other applications that they need. For example, we have students that are taking various research methods courses that require SPSS. So how do we deal with that? We are dealing with that by using Citrix. So students have access to that when they need it. But I think you ask an even bigger question when it comes to those areas that don't have broadband access. And how do we design courses that are multimodal in that respect, and also what are the tools available to help with that? And not all the learning management systems are there. And that's one of our struggles and challenges as instructional designers, is figuring out those learning management systems that will allow us to work within those different confines.
Well, that's a great point. The LMS is really lagged this way.
Yeah, I feel like, at my institution, I think that we're using one of the available LMSs that is probably on the better side of things, but it is an ongoing struggle. And, as we're thinking about, solutions to all these sorts of issues, it's really good to, sort of get as many people as possible thinking about these kinds of considerations that are coming out of the instructional design world. So that's good to hear.
So when students are using their mobile devices to try to do exams and engage in classroom participation online, do they feel that that's a reasonable technological choice, or do they feel like, I wish I had a laptop, but this is all I have? Do you get a sense?
Good question.
I don't get a sense of that because, again, one of the things with my job is I don't necessarily have the student contact that I used to have when I was in the classroom teaching, or even when I did teach some hybrid courses. So I'm not 100% sure, but what I'm hearing from my faculty is that some of the problems students have to do with the fact that they are using these mobile devices. And it's not only their phones, of course, it's different tablets.
Right.
We have more and more students using Chromebooks. And that can sometimes be problematic. So I think we have to meet students where they live. And if they're using their mobile phones as a way to access content and to participate in these online courses, I think we have to go there. I mean, you have to look at what they're doing, for example, in various places in Africa. When I was studying at Syracuse University, I was working with a faculty member who was looking at that. And that is their primary mode of being connected, is using these mobile phones. So it was during that time I realized just how important it was to consider the factors of mobile in our course design. But until the LMSs catch up, and the one we use is kind of there, We have to think of that as well as thinking of accessibility, universal design. So how does all of this work in all of these different tools that we have to use to access learning?
Well, one thing to think about, again, Professor Grawe, based on your findings, is that over the next 10 years, the amount of money that colleges will have to devote to paying for the technology and for the human side of it may well be declining if we see enrollment begin to drop.
It may. Certainly at tuition-dependent schools, that will be the case. If we think about publics, with fewer students, the formulas are going to say that they get less funding. On the other hand, you could argue with the legislature that, look, we have fewer students, there's going to be a windfall for you, but maybe we should be allowed to keep some of that in order to make some of these adjustments. You could imagine the pupil or per pupil spending going up, even though the total expenditure goes down, and that might actually be a good thing. And that could be used to address issues with technology. It could also be used to address issues that we've seen with the shift toward use of adjuncts, for instance. Could you get through this, and while you had a smaller staff, end up with a more professionalized staff, return back to the model of tenure? I'm not going to say that these would be fun paths to go down. We're talking about retrenchment, no matter how you frame it. But on the other hand, if we come out the other side with higher per pupil expenditures and a more continuing tenured staff of faculty, we could at least be in a stronger position overall, despite the pain of going through the process.
What a positive vision! Thank you. We needed that. That's that's the first argument I've seen for having a decline in the adjunct population and increase in tenure. Friends, we're almost out of time. I have to ask one question looking forward. And do you think, up until recently, we've been increasing the number of international students for a variety of reasons, drawing heavily on the entirety of Asia plus the Middle East especially. For various reasons, that number has been going down over the past couple of years. And one of those reasons is called the Trump administration. Do you think, this is a political economy question, not a demographics question, do you think it's possible that U.S. higher ed will be able to somehow recruit successfully and more aggressively abroad, or is that another well that's going to run dry?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question in terms of federal policy can limit the choices that there are. Currently, we have a lot of recruitment in China and Saudi Arabia and Korea. And that's generally true. That's true at my institution. It's true for the country as a whole. India represents an enormous market, and a market that has some money. Obviously, there are a lot of students worldwide who are really, really bright, but if they don't bring money, schools aren't super inclined to recruit them, and B, they don't really solve our problem. But we do see a developing world that's much bigger than those three dominant countries in the international student market. So you can easily imagine schools looking to solve some of their domestic demand issues by bringing in students from abroad. I think there will remain a demand from abroad for U.S. education. Higher education in the United States remains incredibly strong in terms of the quality of the product that we put out.
Yeah.
The wild card, as you noted, are these other forces of what is the attitude toward immigration in general? I remember when I applied to graduate school at the University of Minnesota a number of years ago, in the class that they had recruited before the one I would join, there wasn't a single American, much less Minnesotan, in the class. I can think of all sorts of good reasons why they would want those students. Those students were a boon to the University of Minnesota because they taught a bunch of undergraduates at a very, very, very low rate. They didn't threaten Minnesotans in any meaningful way, but I could also see immediately, well, there's a political problem here, a rhetorical problem. How do you explain a Department of Economics that doesn't recruit any Minnesotans, doesn't even recruit any Americans into its program? I think higher education is certainly going to clamor for international students, but whether the political climate will allow a yes to happen remains to be seen.
That's a fantastic moment to pause on. I'm afraid we're out of time. We have just raced through an hour of frantic conversation. First, Professor Grawe, I want to thank you very much. You've been really, really generous with your time, and your answers have been just fantastic. And I'm looking for, we'll share the recording of this shortly, as soon as we get this up. But above all, let me thank all of the wonderful forum contributors, everybody who have been asking terrific questions. I mean, this has been like a grad level seminar in demographics and what it means for education. Professor Grawe, can we come back to you maybe in a few months or in the fall or next year because
that sounds terrific.
Your findings are vital for education strategy, and I think you're a great resource for everyone thinking about the future of education. Tuesday, we're going to be meeting with two brilliant people, Lee Scalarup-Bissett and Joe Frischione, to talk about the adjunct crisis in higher education. So we can see what's going on as we shift from a majority tenure-track population of faculty to a majority adjunct population. And these are two great people. This is a major issue. I'm really, really looking forward to addressing it. Again, that's next Tuesday. So be prepared.